it's one of these fantastic events we're working with alongside Ethical Reading, and we've been working with Ethical Reading now for 4 years since they've really started, and all of these events are always very interesting. I think anything on AI is going to be fascinating, and we've got some fantastic speakers here this evening, which Brad will be telling you about shortly. So basically, I'm going to pass over to Brad now, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what's going on and MC the event tonight. So over to you, Brad.
Thank you very much. So my name is Brad Hooker, and I'm one of the directors of Ethical Reading. Ethical Reading has been going for 4 years, that's correct. And I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Ethical Reading before we get started. So we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to making Reading a better place to live and work. And we have a number of different programs to pursue this agenda. And then some things that are really not so much part of programs, but come up as hot topics, of which I take it this is one. Ethics and AI is one. This is not our first Ethics and AI event, nor I'm sure will it be our last. Tonight, before I move on to our speakers, I should just briefly say, I want to thank Penningtons very much for hosting us in this wonderful venue, and Apex Plaza for hosting us. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank our partners and supporters who've stuck with us over the 4 years and inspire us with their own leadership of their companies and support us with in many different ways. I should put it that way. So first of all, Geoff is going to speak. Geoff, I'm proud to say, was a PhD student of mine, and then he went straight from being a PhD student of mine to a postdoc at Stanford, and then straight from a postdoc at Stanford into a job in Google's ethics center. So he's about as well qualified on this topic as you could possibly get, not including having been my student. And then I'll wait and introduce Hilary after Geoff has spoken, if that's all right. So
yeah. Thank you so much. Righty-ho. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Brad, for the invitation. It's great to be back at Ethical Reading, and great to be back in person as well. This is my first in-person talk in like 2 years or something. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about ethics and language models. You've probably heard of ChatGPT by now, unless you've been living under a rock. I'm going to be talking to you about some of the ethical issues that these kinds of systems give rise to. First, I want to tell you a little bit about me, how I got here, why I'm talking to you. So I'm a research scientist at Google. I work in a machine intelligence group called Cerebra, which is within Google Research. I'm among the research scientists, I'm a bit weird, which is an achievement, in that I came from a philosophy background. I did my PhD on the ethics of autonomous vehicles, and then I moved over to Stanford, as Brad said, where I did a lot of interdisciplinary work at the intersection of philosophy and computer science. So I was interested in questions like, what does it mean for a machine learning system to make fair decisions? What does it mean for a machine learning system to make explainable decisions? And then I moved over to Google, first in the health org, and now in Google Research, where I work on language models. My current job has 3 parts, as you can see. The first is research. I'm interested in philosophical questions that arise at the technological frontier. What do current questions, or what kinds of philosophical questions do systems like ChatGPT present? How can we think about the different answers to those questions and defend plausible views in response to those questions? I also do a lot of interdisciplinary work, where I work with everyone from medical doctors through to computer scientists to operationalize ethical principles. So how do you take a principle like health equity and turn that into an operationalizable metric for evaluating machine learning systems? More recently, I've moved as well to do some work in ethical culture change. So I work on a program at Google called Moral Imagination, where we go around to research and product teams, and we get them to articulate value tensions in their work and then have structured conversations about those value tensions to try and arrive at actionable responses, whether that's in product requirement documents or OKRs. Finally, I'm also trying to do a lot of engagement work. I think it's really important that organizations like Google engage in the societal conversation around the ethics of AI, around responsible innovation. So I like to go and give talks like this, or go into universities or schools to try and contribute to that conversation on behalf of Google. Okay, so today I'm going to structure the talk around sort of 3 points. The first is, what are language models? Second, I'm going to introduce 3 ethical issues around language models. And then I'm going to talk about some of the technical mitigation strategies that we've got on the table at the moment for thinking about those issues and for dealing with them. Okay, so what are language models? At the core, a language model is basically a system that predicts the next word. Given a sequence of words, it can tell you what the most likely successor word is. The basic hypothesis around language models is the following. A system that can reliably predict the next word can also reliably simulate a set of capabilities, such as mathematical reasoning, translation, general knowledge, and arithmetic. That may seem like a really weird hypothesis, but the basic thought is, if you can make it the case that a system can reliably predict the next word, and you can translate a capability into a word prediction task, then it's the case that you're going to be able to reliably simulate those capabilities. That may still seem a bit weird, so we're going to have to do an interactive game to illustrate this. The game is called Predict the Next Word. It's very simple. I'm going to read a sentence to you, and then you predict the next word by enthusiastically shouting it out. Okay? We ready? So should we do this one as a warm-up? So predict the next. Great. Okay. Absolutely, absolutely. Cool. Okay, so this is a general knowledge question. The capital of France is Paris. Good. The next one's a bit harder. It's a maths question. 21 times 11. Good, good. Good smart notes. The trick is to add the 2 digits and then put the sum in the middle. Did you know that? We're 11 times tabled. Okay, linguists. Ciudad is the Spanish word for city. Good, good. Accountants, your time to shine. EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and good, good. Okay, reasoning. It's like a Google interview question. If Adam is Beth's brother and Beth is Kathy's daughter, then Adam is Kathy's son. Good, tentatively correct. Good. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that you can take a bunch of capabilities, like reasoning, like mathematical understanding, and you can turn them into word prediction problems. So if you can train a system to reliably predict the next word, then you can train a system to reliably pretend to do mathematics, to pretend to do reasoning, and all that other stuff, right? Pretty clever. So how do we do this in practice? Well, the first thing you do is you take a generic data set of text, like the entirety of Wikipedia. Wikipedia has 2.5 billion words. It's a huge, huge data set of coherent text. And then what you do is something called self-supervised learning, which is basically like a set of tasks which can be automated over very, very large quantities of text. So stuff like predict the next sentence or predict the missing word in the sentence. And you undergo this huge trial and error process where you automate this. So the model might have to predict the missing word in a random sentence from Wikipedia. And then you just keep doing that, and you keep updating the model parameters every time it makes a mistake, so that the model gets better and better at predicting the missing word, right? And over time, the model gets really, really good at predicting the missing words, right? And then what you have is this huge system, like GPT-3, which can reliably generate entire passages of coherent text. It's fantastic. And it can also reliably, stimulate all of these skills, like mathematical reasoning, like logical reasoning. But it doesn't actually know how to do this. It's just like predicting the missing word, okay? It's just statistics over language, but it doesn't look very impressive. How do you actually use these systems in practice? There's kind of 2 different methods that you can do. One is called few-shot learning, where you give it some examples. So for example, biblioteca means library, casa means house, agua means water, leche means milk. Good. That's called few-shot learning. So you give some examples, and then it will sort of extrapolate from the examples you can give. Probably the more interesting example of like how these models can be used is called fine-tuning. So what's fine-tuning? We'll take like an arbitrarily specific use case for a machine learning model. like predicting whether or not a patient will be readmitted to hospital after 30 days given some written clinical notes. Okay, that's a super, super specific thing to do. What fine-tuning does is it kind of breaks that task down. Like the first thing you need to know what to do is understand English, right? If you can understand English, you're probably most of the way there to being able to do that task, right? So you take like a giant pre-trained model like GPT-3, which understands English, and you use that as your base model. Then on top of that, you not only need to understand English, but you need to understand clinical English. You need to understand the kind of language that doctors use, the kind of language which correlates with readmission. So what you do is you train the model, the generic fine-tune, you train the generic like English model on some specific clinical language. So you take like a load of electronic health records or a load of medical papers, and you teach the model to predict the missing word on those papers and those clinical notes. Then the model gets good at medical language understanding. And then the very, very last bit is just like, okay, you give it some examples of clinical notes and you tell it whether or not the patient was admitted into hospital again after 30 days, right? And basically by starting with a sort of very generic model that can do loads of different things and then fine tuning it to a particular use case, you can drastically reduce the amount of training data that you would otherwise need. So in the sort of prior machine learning paradigm, you would need loads and loads and loads of examples of, say, patient clinical notes and answers about whether or not the patient was readmitted. By instead using a model like GPT-3 as your base model, you can drastically reduce that amount of training data that you need. Oh, my text has disappeared. Okay. I knew there was going to be a technical error in translating the Google Slides into PowerPoint. Okay. So what this slide would say, had the slides worked, is language models are obviously going to be a hugely transformative technology. We've seen over the last few weeks the power that ChatGPT has had, the immense number of users that have flocked to it, and the huge multiplicity of use cases that people have found for it. But what we need to do is make sure that such a transformative technology is used in a way which benefits everyone, in a way where the benefits of that technology are equitable. And in thinking through that challenge, what's come up is like a variety of ethical issues that we need to think about and that we need to mitigate against. So what I'm going to do is take you through three of the big ones that I'm currently worrying about. The first is toxicity. One study found, by typing the prompt in, 2 Muslims walked into GPT-3 100 times, that 66% of those times, it came out with references to killing, shooting, violence, terrorism. So things like, 2 Muslims walked into a synagogue with axes and a bomb. Right? GPT-3 did that 66 out of 100 times in an experiment. And it's not just religious bias, it's also gender bias, sexual orientation bias, all kinds of toxic language can be found in these models. Why is that? Well, these models are trained on vast quantities of internet text, right? And if you look at the internet, the term terrorism co-varies with the term Muslim extensively. It's commonly the case that if you see the word Muslim, that in the same sentence, the word terrorism will also be found on these huge internet text data sets. And that leads the model to infer a semantic dependency between the two terms. And that means that if you put the term Muslim in your prompt, the chances are you'll get terrorism out in the model's response, right? So that's one class of problems we need to deal with. How do you deal with the toxicity of the language on the internet when your models are just basically regurgitating those kinds of semantic dependencies? Okay, I've now worked out what the problem is. My headings are missing. So another ethical issue that we're dealing with is data privacy. Thankfully, my image is like relatively instructive for what you might expect to find. Okay, there's two ways in which language models can violate what you might take to be people's right to privacy. The first is private data leakage. So there's all kinds of private data on the internet. There's people's phone numbers, there's people's addresses, there's people's full names, people may even give their bank details on the internet. So if you train a model on all of that data, the chances are that the model encoded in its weights will remember some of that data and be able to regurgitate that if given the right prompt. That can happen by accident, but it can also happen in adversarial ways if people are deliberately engineering prompts to try and get people's private data. So that's a problem. Another thing that the model can do is infer private information about you. It might, from its extensive understanding of linguistic dependencies, be able to infer something that you take to be a privacy violation. It may infer, for instance, your sexuality based on other things that you've said to the model, and you may take that as a privacy violation. Okay, so that's another problem we're presently dealing with. Then a third problem is the problem of algorithmic bias implicit within the model. So, I'm sorry, my heading said something very informative here. But the basic problem is this. If you imagine all the text on the internet, most of it is written in English or Chinese. Most of the English text is about the Western world. So, like most of the sentences on the internet pertain to the United States, they pertain to Europe, and they don't pertain to, say, African countries and South American countries. Some researchers at Stanford did this really interesting experiment with Google's language model BERT, where they looked into its brain, which is called an embedding space. And what they found is that BERT's representation of the concept of America compared to other country names was such that America was really, really distinct compared to other countries. So to unpack this for you a bit, you can basically think of BERT as taking each country name and mapping it into a three-dimensional space, right? And the closer two dots are together in that space, the more BERT takes them to be semantically related to each other. America was like right out there on its own. There was only a handful of countries nearby, whereas all the South American countries were clustered together in a little flap. What does that mean? Well, it means that for BERT, the South American countries are kind of hazy, and the African countries are kind of hazy, whereas America, Europe, those kinds of countries are much more semantically distinct. It has a better understanding of those concepts. That's kind of weird, right? The authors put it really nicely. They said that BERT was basically reflecting the European and American tendency to treat Africa as a single homogeneous entity, right? It's a really interesting way to reflect it. Okay, so those are the problems we're dealing with. How are we going to solve them? So, again, my headings are gone. So, one thing that we can do is data filtration. So you can go through the internet and you can filter out all the different web pages that contain problematic material from which the model may learn biases. So, for example, you could go and take the word gay, search for all the documents on the internet, and take out every document with the word gay in it. And then GPT-3 is not going to learn associations between homosexuality and drug use and other things that's been shown to have learned. But that's actually a pretty crude and crass solution. You kind of don't want to do that for a few reasons. One is that if you exclude all the web pages with gay on, then you're going to end up systematically excluding LGBT content from your training data, which is going to mean that the model is not going to understand LGBT discourse as well as it otherwise would. Right, so it's not obviously a good solution. In addition to that, you might also think that having an understanding of problematic content might be useful for downstream use cases. So suppose, for instance, you wanted to take your model to fine-tune it to identify harmful content on YouTube comments or on Facebook comments. If your model has never encountered these kinds of toxic forms of speech, then it's not going to be able to be used downstream as a toxic speech classifier, right? Which is a real limitation on the way in which these models can be used. So dataset filtration, sometimes we use it for extreme cases, but it's actually a pretty blunt instrument and it's not ideal for language models. Okay, another thing we can do, which is a lot more promising, is dataset diversification, right? So we can actually go out there into the world and try and build much more diverse datasets. So we can try and engage lots more languages than just English Wikipedia, so that the model understands a much broader class of languages. And we can also try to actively solicit content from authors from different communities, different walks of life, right? A really, really good example of this is the Bloom language model. This is a great project inspired by CERN in physics, where a bunch of people got together with funding from the French government and decided they were going to build a GPT-3-like model, but in an open science way. So everything was documented, all the data was there. They actively tried to recruit data from 46 different languages. It was a fantastic project, and the model performs much better than GPT-3 in terms of its broad linguistic understanding. Okay, so lots of advantages to that. You get better performance across linguistic tasks. You get reduced toxic content. There are some downsides. It's incredibly expensive to source data of that kind and quality. And there's also independent ethical questions about data ownership and stewardship, right? It's not just enough to say, okay, we're going to take data from this community. Like, really, you want to engage that community and work with the communities so that they feel that they have some sense of like ownership or co-creation of the model. That's really what we want to be aiming for, not just taking their material and building a model on top of it. Okay, another thing we can do is what's called safety fine-tuning. So a good example of this is Google's Lambda model that you may have seen in the news at some point. So Lambda is fine-tuned on a huge data set of labeled examples of problematic versus non-problematic speech. And what Lambda can do under the hood is every time it produces a sentence, it can predict for you whether that sentence is ethically appropriate or not, based on a huge set of labeled examples. And then it can filter out the sentences predicted to be ethically inappropriate, right? And what we found is that Lambda produces significantly less ethically problematic content once it's undergone that fine-tuning. Again, the fine-tuning is very expensive to do because you need a very large number of conversational interactions that have to be labeled by human raters as appropriate or inappropriate. And it's also not foolproof. It's still possible for Lambda to produce problematic content, but this is a significant mitigation against that. There can also be interesting unintended consequences. So when you have labelers rating according to certain rating criteria, it might be the case that your rating criteria didn't cover all ethical bases, or it might be the case that you were making certain ethical assumptions that aren't universally shared. So again, there's a lot of work to be done in working out exactly what it means to do ethical fine-tuning in a way which is kind of inclusive and community-orientated. You really need broad input from stakeholders to determine what kind of values are going to drive those labeling decisions. Otherwise, it's a bit arbitrary and you're probably going to miss stuff. The final thing we can do is what's called reinforcement learning with human feedback. Again, my heading is missing. So reinforcement learning with human feedback is this really cool thing, pretty similar to safety fine-tuning in character, where we get the model to output a range of responses, and then we get humans to rank those in terms of their ethical appropriateness. So the thought is you can then reward the model based on how appropriate its responses are, so that the model over time learns to come up with more ethically appropriate responses. The costs and benefits of this are pretty similar to safety fine-tuning. If you want to do this well, you need to do it in an inclusive way where you have a lot of people who can give broad input into the kinds of values that we want to reflect when we're rewarding the model for doing ethical speech. If you don't do it that way, what you might end up with is a pretty homogenous set of views, a bunch of weird white guys from Google coming up with what they take to be ethics, right? We don't want that. What we want is broad stakeholder engagement, which can inform that effort. You may also think as well that there's unintended consequences potentially. So the reinforcement learning will cover a broad class of cases, but you don't know how the model is going to respond when it receives text which it's not seen in that training process. You certainly can't take reinforcement learning with human feedback to be an exhaustive solution to the ethical problems, but it certainly, again, it mitigates the amount that the model can output biased or otherwise toxic content. And you can similarly use this to try and dissuade the model from outputting private information too. So to wrap up, language models are a potentially transformative technology, right? They will change the world, almost certainly. Language models have some pretty serious ethical problems. Data privacy issues, toxicity, bias. We do have a bunch of technical safeguards that we're presently working on, but those technical safeguards are a kind of shell. You really need broad community input to inform how those technical safeguards are used in order for those technical safeguards to be kind of actually conducive to ethical, responsible innovation. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions after Hilary's talk.
It's my pleasure to introduce Hilary, who is a partner at Penningtons, and she's traveled here today from Cambridge for this presentation. She's an expert, I think, in employment law mainly, with an emphasis on education and technology. So highly qualified for this presentation. I'll leave the clicker for you.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Feels a bit weird as a lawyer coming to talk about things that are ethical. I could make some jokes, but I'm not very good at them. So I'm going to get to do the really boring bit about how the law hasn't quite caught up with some of the concepts, and quite frankly never will, and what the problems in respect of that are likely to be. So the law always looks at things somewhere behind all these clever people, you clever people who are busy sorting these bits and pieces out. And whilst we can always go, look, it's got all these great things that can happen using artificial intelligence, all these models, all these wonderful ways that we're going to go forward, I'm here to talk about all the things that aren't quite as good and where the liability in respect of those are likely to come, where they're already coming, and why legal regulation, quite frankly, is not necessarily going to help with some of the ethical problems, but will start causing people like me to get more and more busy as the technology develops. So, as at the moment, we do not have any law that as such covers the various issues to do with artificial intelligence as a coherent set of laws. So what we have to do is we have to go, right, so where's this problem coming from? Where's that problem coming from? And put together the various bits of legislation that already exist and work out how they're going to interact with each other or not. There's quite a lot of not still happening in respect of that. As at the moment, these are the broad areas that we are already seeing issues coming out from. So human rights, rights in respect to privacy, that's already been touched on, rights in respect of expression, but particularly things like data protection. 4 or 5 years ago, I spent all my life talking about GDPR. I thought that I would have finished talking about GDPR. I'm never going to finish talking about GDPR. I'm never going to finish talking about how the law tries to manage the use of data. And I'm never going to stop being someone supervising, someone having to go through 500,000 documents to find the relevant one when some annoying person makes a data subject access request to try and work out where these bits and pieces have come from. More problematically, and certainly from the perspective of the kind of work I do, the Equality Act is going to come in and regulate this, perhaps in ways that people haven't thought about. So Geoff has already talked about how some of this stuff, you get toxic answers. Toxic answers are likely to be discriminatory answers and lead to difficulties. Those in turn can leave if you're an employee. Everyone deals with people. Most people are employed one way or another with employment cases. But also we're starting to see other bits and pieces, particularly where ChatGPT and artificial intelligence generally is creating content that may or may not be true, that may or may not be accurate, that may or may not be being passed off as being original. And so there are also places where some of my colleagues, and I confess I asked for some help in respect of what to say about defamation and copyright, we are seeing some issues in respect of that too. The regulations we've got, it can help. It can help with some of the bias, but it can't eliminate it. It won't do anything in respect of it. That's for people who understand how machine learning works to try to deal with it, but to be aware that what we have got is we have got guidance, but the guidance has to effectively follow the technology. I'm not going to be the person who predicts what's going to happen next. I'm going to be the person who has the problem. This is what's happened, so how do we solve it? Whereas the people actually looking at this have got to say, well, actually, we've done some of the experiments. We know some of this stuff is toxic and can have these various problems associated with it. But what we are now finding is algorithms, AI, different technologies are being used, and they're being used by people who do not understand how they've been created. And one takeaway I always have, and one of my biggest difficulties, is I have to understand enough to be able to apply the law that I practice to what is happening on machine learning, on a data set. And that's not my background. And we're all going to have to get there, because we're all going to have to understand a little bit where the bias comes in, how it works. Even if we can't do the maths and we can't run an algorithm and we don't do the experiment, the people who do because of the need for human interface with some of this, are going to have to understand far more than we do already. I don't know much about lots of bits of science, but I had to catch up. And I think everyone else is going to end up in the same position, because otherwise the regulatory framework isn't going to work and all sorts of difficult things will happen. So where does this stuff come? It's already being used quite a lot within recruitment. That's the place where we are seeing the biggest sets of cases, the biggest sets of problems, and it effectively allows, artificial intelligence effectively allows large data sifts that actually lots and lots of organizations are already using data sifts to filter CVs. They're using videos on Teams calls to decide which people get called for a person-to-person interview. And there are lots of places where I can say, that's brilliant. It's standard. It doesn't mean I give you a job because you look like me and I like you, which 20 years ago maybe was what was happening. But actually doesn't remove all of that unless you know what you're buying in. So as an organisation, if you buy in one of these tools, even if you buy in a tool that is well used, if you don't understand it, then you've got human biases being replicated without ever knowing where they came from. And that's one of the problems that we are seeing. So we are going to have to find people, whether it's Google, whether it's other technology companies, actually test this stuff, and people buying it needing to understand what is actually happening, because if you don't, then you're going to unlawfully discriminate. You're going to end up being the person who associates the Muslim with a terrorist. You're going to end up doing that without realizing that that is what you have done. And legally, you're going to be responsible for what you've bought and how you've used it, even if you never understood where it was coming from. Equally, everyone does have their human rights in respect of this. So everyone has the right to privacy. So whilst there is machine learning, inferences, all those other bits and pieces, there are places where the law is going to turn around and go, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. And again, where are the people who are going to come and bring the complaints in respect of it? They're going to be the employees. They're going to be the students. It's going to be people complaining that there's been some interference with their rights, and that the law very much in this country only allows interference in limited cases. Again, it's be careful what you wish for, know what you're buying. Also, if you use any of these tools, you're processing personal data, or the company or the organisation you've bought in, you're processing personal data. I said I wasn't going to talk about GDPR. I always talk about GDPR because data protection is everywhere. And if you're going to use any personal data, and all of this machine learning is learning about data from people, what is the basis to do it? None of us have consented to our data being used. So we can't use consent, and actually lawyers hate using consent for GDPR anyway. It never works. So what we've got to look at is we've got to look at another reason to be using this data. When I deal with matters to do with data protection, I spend my life talking to people about necessary, because the law in respect of data protection is whatever condition you use to be processing data, it must be necessary. Is it necessary to be using any of these tools? And is it necessary for a legitimate interest? Now, you can say, yes, it is. You can say, no, it's not. And you can build it in. But if you're going to use that, what's the legal obligation? What's the reason? What's the public interest? What's the legitimate interest? The time to think about it is at the beginning. It's not at the end when you've got a problem. Because if you think about something at the beginning, you can turn around and go, actually, I am allowed to use this tool because I've built it into the process that I'm using. And I've made it clear to the customer, the employee, the student, whoever else it might be, that this is what I'm doing, this is where I'm doing it, this is how I'm doing it, this is what I do with the data, this is what the tool I've bought is doing with the data, this is when I get rid of it. Because if you don't think about it at the beginning, you may not like GDPR, but GDPR may turn around and say that this is not what you should be doing. Equally, in the UK at the moment, you are still allowed to object to a decision being made about you by an automated process, by something that is not a human. And that includes anything to do with legal profiling, anything about how it affects somebody as an individual. The places to change that are very much based on whether it's necessary for a contract. So again, you can build something into your contractual terms, but the time to think about it is at the beginning when you're drafting your contractual terms. If it's authorised under EU or member state, or we've moved it across into English law, or if it's based on consent. The other thing that there is very much in here is that there is the right to actually safeguard people's fundamental rights and freedoms. But before, talked about the Human Rights Act. That's where your fundamental rights and freedoms come. They come for privacy, they come for expression, they come for making sure that actually you have a right to protect those things, because they are your right as a human, and no machine is going to come and override those. But the human can put the protection in, and there is a very important part that even if you use these tools, if you put a layer of human decision making over it, it stops being automated decision making, and that enables them to actually get through some of this mess in respect of the law. One takeaway. I always try to do takeaways. If you're going to do any of this, you have to do one of these. You have to do something called a data protection impact assessment. Lawyers, we like bits of paper, or bits on a computer that used to be a bit of paper. And this does mean that you have to actually assess what you're going to do. So if you use any of these tools in any decision making, you have to actually think, what is the impact of this on the human being on the other side of it for anything that could be high risk? That's particularly the case if it's going to include LGBT status, race, ethnicity, religion, age, trade union activities. We're living in a world where industrial relations might be the new frontier for employment lawyers. So all of those other bits and pieces, you've got to think about high risk data. So if you're processing, even with a tool, data that picks up what I'm going to call protected characteristics, which are broadly the things within discrimination law, then you have to be doing a data protection impact assessment. You also have to be doing it whenever you're monitoring anybody, whenever you're surveillancing anybody, whenever you're using facial recognition, whenever you've got a thumbprint to get in and there's biometric data coming forward in respect of it. So you need to be thinking about all of these bits and pieces where it is necessary for actual reasons that are substantial and legitimate, and you have thought about it. And again, lawyer takeaway, do a bit of paper to say that this is what you are actually doing. Equally, if you're using just tools, you have got to put in place particular things. Back to my human intervention. Anytime you can say, actually, I did stop and think about it, and I thought about the bias that I learned about when I came to this wonderful talk and heard from the guy from Google. Sorry, I should call you Geoff. Heard from the guy from Google, and I thought about that, but I still want to monitor when my Amazon worker goes off and goes to the loo, and actually that's all been in the press again, and I need to monitor how long it takes them to walk from that end of the building to that end of the building, because I need to think about time and management. Or I need to monitor what's happening on someone's iPhone. It's my iPhone, I paid for it, I'm going to look at those types of bits and pieces. And what you have to think about is, what's the adverse impact of doing that on a particular group of people? And back to one of the things I said before, why is it still necessary to be doing it, and record a thought process? If you don't, this is where you get into difficulty. The Equality Act. These are the cases we are now seeing. So as an employment lawyer, I am now seeing cases where people are turning around and saying, I have been discriminated against because I am black, white, female, old, young, straight, lesbian, gay, whatever it may be, because of the machine learning. And there is no defence to this if you fall foul of the definition in the Equality Act. This is direct discrimination, but if you treat somebody less favourably than another person because of a protected characteristic, because has quite a wide meaning for these purposes, then you are discriminating against the person who is treated less favourably. And even if you did not intend to do it, even if you wanted to use these tools for the good, but it has the unintended consequences of treating B less favourably than A, there is no defence. There is no defence to these types of claims. It's just choosing the right person for A, the right person for B. And is it because they were the Muslim, because that's what the language has learnt, or is it for another reason? And it's quite difficult to say, no, it's nothing to do with because they were a Muslim, because Geoff's just told us that that's what the language learning is doing. It's not because you bought the product, it's because the product has learnt based on all our bias, all our toxicity, all the rubbish that's over on the internet that hasn't been thought through properly. And these things are already bringing cases. They're already bringing bad publicity. And we're already having people saying, well, actually, I wasn't selected for this job because I was not suggested because I was neurodivergent and I can't do quite the same eye contact as a neurotypical person might be. And the computer thinks I'm not engaging properly because that's what it's learnt. It doesn't realise that I don't do eye contact for other reasons. So we are already seeing these cases. These are actually quite old newspaper articles showing where cases are making difficulty. Face recognition software, we've got cases saying it's racist. I'm going to bring the case because I'm not getting the job taking you back to the station. You wouldn't need Uber to go back to the station from Reading, but I'm not getting the job taking you back because the app has been built with this inherent bias in, and it hasn't worked it out, and the person hasn't learnt that these are the problems. And more to the point, the people you employ, the people you engage with, your customers, they don't know what some of this AI is doing. I don't know what a lot of this AI is doing, and I come and talk about the problems with AI and discrimination. So one of the things that is beginning to happen is people are looking at some of this. This is a research study. I've taken a couple of slides from it, where the government is actually funding research to work out what is happening when people like Google and others are moving forwards to say, okay, how did you know before you came to these sessions what was happening about systems using your personal data? This is a survey done across the board, and lots of people were asked questions saying, well, I knew a little bit about it, but did I know how this was going to work? And it just goes to show we're still at less than 50% of the population know that these are how the decisions are being taken. When we get up to much higher proportions, all the people who phone us and say, can I sue X, Y, and Z, they're going to double or they're going to triple because of the level of awareness as that comes forward. Bluntly, that's what keeps people like me in work. And generally, when you know that decisions are being made about people using AI, do you know what biases are already built in? And again, most people are still not realising that there are these biases built in, and that's going to change because I've already put some newspaper articles there showing that things are going to change, and it's something again just to guard against. Again, this is another survey. This one's now 3 years old. I probably should have updated it, but Geoff's already said, well, what happens if AI is built by white men at Google? What's the problem in respect of that? And it's very clear it's not yet proving to be adept at recognising other people, because AI learns from everything that it's been told to learn from. So it has the wrong data to understand unless someone does something much cleverer than I can in order to actually create the accuracy. And at the moment, it's not getting there. So that's one of the other things. When I last updated this, which admittedly was fairly recently, there were a couple of other things that I thought were worth at least highlighting before we moved on to questions. I'm going to admit I borrowed some of this content from a couple of my colleagues because I'm not a defamation lawyer, but I know that there are some problems in respect of it. If you use AI and it is inaccurate and you rely on it and you publish it, anybody can still be liable, and actually it's built into quite a lot of the terms and conditions that you're still liable for what you adopt. So if you take all Muslims are terrorists, or 60-something% of Muslims are terrorists, and you say, well, that's what my research shows me, because that's what the AI model showed me, that X percent of Muslims are terrorists because etc., etc., because that's what the AI has learnt. And then you happen to write something that's toxic or that is discriminatory and it identifies somebody. You may have thought that the AI research is accurate. Hopefully you wouldn't with these kind of examples, but you don't quite know what is happening. To be liable for something in defamation, if you republish it, even if you borrowed the content from somewhere else, then you bear responsibility for whatever is said. So if you have learnt from something that wasn't Wikipedia that something you believe to be true and it is not, you may still have a defence in defamation. But if you republish it and you don't know whether it's true, then you're in greater difficulty. So if people pull information from one of these tools and republish, repackage, take something in respect of it, then you can still be liable for what has been happened. And the person who helped me with this content actually did have a case. A lot of this comes from a case where he acted for someone who was defamed by a tweet written by a volunteer that went in someone else's name. At least we knew what was happening there. I'm telling you that the conditions of anything you buy in will make sure that the liability rests with whoever publishes rather than whoever creates it. So anybody pinching this stuff, buyer beware, I think is what I would say with that. So then also, what happens in respect of copyright? So lots and lots of people are talking about, well, what happens in education? We've got loads of essay mills. Students are pinching material and pretending they can write a play like Shakespeare, or they're pinching material and they're pretending they can write some, I don't know, cyber hack. I mean, various different things are happening. And in UK law, we are allowing copyright to subsist in machine generated content. So basically, even if an AI tool has written it, there is copyright in it. But ChatGPT, for example, ChatGPT, its terms of use state that it's owned by the user. So effectively, then what you've got is the user is owning the stuff that has been created to the extent that is allowed by applicable law. I'm not going to pretend I know anything about American law. I'm only marginally pretending I know very much about defamation law. But in the UK, the content can be owned by a user. So in the UK, if you take this material, you can own it. But that doesn't prevent somebody using AI generated content and therefore being sued by whoever originally generated the material. Because this stuff's trawling the internet, doing all sorts of clever bits and pieces. And if content has been taken, even if it's been manipulated, but it has been taken from another database, from another author, from another third party, then it can be that that third party, not ChatGPT or whichever tool, will find the person reusing it when you didn't know you'd taken whatever it was from a third party, and is liable potentially in respect to copyright. I hope, but I'm going to leave this to much cleverer people than me, that this is not likely to be that much of a problem because of the size of the data set, that actually it's being manipulated enough that it's not genuinely copyrightable material. But equally, there are still essay mills selling essays to 16, 17-year-old students, and there's AI detecting where did it come from. So if people are going to go and buy this in order to write a sonnet written by Shakespeare, even if it's not written by Shakespeare, there will be the technology to say, well, actually, it's still plagiarized. And that's going to be another area where litigation will follow. And I'm told by the person who helped me with this slide, there is already litigation in respect of copyright on material that's coming out in respect of ChatGPT. So just before I finish and move over to questions to either Geoff or I, technology, AI, it's the next frontier. We have done discrimination. We've done this. We've done this. We are going to get cases for this because it becomes mainstream. As soon as technology becomes mainstream and everybody uses it, there is infinite scope to keep people like me busy. And I'm not yet going to be replaced by a robot doing all the law that we do. And claims are becoming more and more frequent. in respect of goods, in respect of services, and equally, people like me, we're quite happy to take claims from 200-300 people at the same time in order to do mass litigation in respect of some of these things. Those are really expensive to defend. Geoff said it's expensive to make your data work. It's even more expensive if your data doesn't work, because that's the point where people like me will take cases on and go, actually, I'm quite interested in that. I'll do that case. I might do it for 5 people. I might do it for 10 people, but this is not going to go away. And the expense of getting it wrong could well be higher than the expense of getting it right. And just finally, before I move over in respect to questions, these are just a couple of bits of guidance that I decided to put up there that actually shows that the government is looking at it. It's trying to get the regulation to catch up. It hasn't done yet, but we are seeing new stuff coming out all of the time. And at that point, I think I am going to shut up and ask for questions.
Very much, Hilary. So we are going to have a question time, and then we'll return to a kind of summing up period, right? Yeah. Okay. So questions.
What is this technology used for? Give me an example.
Yeah, so you can divide language models into sort of 2 rough categories. There's generative language models like GPT-3, and then there's what we call like encoder-only language models. Right now, the encoder-only language models have been the most useful. So basically, they take a sort of bit of text and they produce a mathematical representation of that text, which you can then feed into other machine learning models through the fine-tuning process that I mentioned. A model like BERT, which Google released in 2018, has been cited literally thousands of times with people applying it to different use cases. That can be everything from processing legal text for classification problems to processing medical text for like risk assessments. Basically anything that might allow you to sort of do a risk score or a classification based on text. The encoder models are great for doing that. For the generative models like GPT-3, there's like just a panoply of use cases, whether that's, I'm generating sort of autocomplete writing aids, all the way through to, nefarious use cases like generating loads and loads and loads of content for Twitter bots to go and like propel a particular political point of view. There's so many use cases.
So obviously, human language is very nuanced. We all use it differently. It's because I'm sick. How does it differentiate between that? So the word sick, which is the word slang, and the word we understand.
Yeah, I mean, the question can be answered at various levels of abstraction. So at a high level of abstraction, like if particular text features on the internet in with enough frequency, then the model is going to pick up how that's used in different contexts and will be able to reliably deal with it. It's certainly been the case in the past that natural language processing used much smaller data sets, like say, I don't know, newspaper articles from a particular newspaper from 1990 to 1995. Those models tended to be quite bad with slang because slang evolves much faster than the language that's used by journalists. But the more recent models, which are trained on large quantities of internet text, do pretty well with slang terms. But it's also worth saying that they're kind of static. So the models won't update as the language updates. They will take a kind of snapshot of the language at a particular time and then be good for up till that time.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a technology recruiter as a partner in Ethical Reading as well. I've got a question for Hilary. I asked my LinkedIn network ahead of coming here today what their major concern was in relation to what we're going to be talking about. And they said it was the replacement of, within the customer experience world, the replacement of human decision making with AI decision making. I was wondering, do people have a legal right to know if a decision has been made by an AI model? And if so, can they ask for a review by a human?
Yes, and yes. So it's just on the basis that any decision that's made purely automated should be covered in privacy notices and elsewhere. And everybody has the right not to have purely automated decision making made about them. How good the human review has to be, that's a bit open to question. So lots of human reviews aren't that far off a box tick. But in answer to your question, yes and yes.
Thank you.
These ethics laws and so on, if they apply to a medium-sized company, they're going to be quite effective, if the fine is quite large. But when you've got much larger corporations, and you've got things like Cambridge Analytica, which is able to sway entire governments to be voted in, they could just look at the penalty they're facing and be like, you know what, we don't care, we're going to use all of the AI tools that we have for our own good, and they're just going to completely circumvent any penalties. What do we do in this kind of situation?
And in reality, vote for somebody else, but Cambridge Analytica are going to stop you trying to do that, or Twitterbot, or do whatever else it may be, in circumstances where, however hard I think the European Union and closely associated countries are trying to stop that. We've probably already lost to Russia, China and America in respect of some of those bits and pieces. All you can really do is try to make sure that the decisions you yourselves are taking are ethical, you understand them. Then we end up with the things that are some version of vote with your feet. So when it comes to, for example, decisions being taken that are purely automated, I've made lots of jokes about GDPR, and I should have probably looked up the level of some of the fines, but some of them that are coming through, okay, they're not enough for Google or for Meta, but they're still quite significant fines coming through. What we need to do is fund the regulators, but you tell me, are we willing to do that? Or you make Google employ people like Geoff to make sure they make ethical decisions in the first place.
Question for the audience, really. I'm just intrigued to know how many of you have actually had a play with ChatGPT and have experienced what it can do. Yeah. Nuts, isn't it? And it's just the price of time. Right. So when we get to 5, 6, 7, 8, it'll be insane.
Yeah, I mean, just to to clarify that point. So ChatGPT is a kind of research prototype released by OpenAI, but the model on which ChatGPT is based is called GPT-3, and that has been out since I think 2021, maybe 2020, and it's actually been kind of pretty widely in use before ChatGPT came out. So you can use the OpenAI API to use ChatGPT. There's even quite substantial products built on this. So if any of you are computer programmers, you might have seen GitHub Copilot. That product is based on a model called Codex, which is a fine-tuned version of GPT-3, which has been trained on code. So there's already kind of more sophisticated kind of product type things being built on top of GPT-3. This is just like a very public display by OpenAI to say, look, this technology is here, please people use it, what can we learn from their interactions with it?
I'm interested in terms of the use of these algorithm-driven recruitment tools and what right the users of such tools have to understand the kind of ethics behind them. So as a recruiter, say, how would I understand whether a tool that I'm using is built on an ethical data set and is discriminating or not? So, for example, if I commonly filter out candidates which indicate they don't have a visa, and that's how I'm filtering out algorithms learning off my behaviour. Actually, it's learning that I'm filtering out candidates who don't have traditionally British names, which is not my intention. So where the responsibility lie for the algorithm picking up the wrong behaviour? Does that make sense?
In the you filter out candidates who don't have a visa, which therefore leads to filtering out candidates who may not have traditionally British names. If that leads to a discriminatory decision, then the responsibility lies with you for buying the algorithm. How you discover what it does and how it works, that is the point where I will say, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a technologist. You have to try to understand what it does. What we would always recommend is, for example, in the example you just gave, you keep challenging that assumption. So when you are doing this, once every X decisions, you say, well, actually, am I still happy with that? Because that's how a lot of the time we've worked out other things were going wrong. It's the human, there's something that doesn't quite feel right is usually good enough. In respect of that particular example, I said the problem, when I was talking, I said the problem is when it's a direct discrimination claim, when you say that you treat someone less favourably because of a protected characteristic. If it is learning to filter out names, that is not a protected characteristic. So you're actually in the different area of discrimination law and you can justify it. But you can only justify it if it's what legally is going to be described as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, equals, is there a less discriminatory way you can do the same thing? And that's going to pick up the size of your organisation. Is there a way you can deal with this? Can you afford to do all the stuff Geoff was talking about to make sure your data and your models and things along those lines are legitimate? If the answer to that is no, then it is looking at, well, what do you know about what you're buying? What do the terms look like about what you're buying? And periodically you do the sniff test, which isn't very legal, but actually a lot of the time, if you think, well, it's filtering out these names, it's filtering out those names, if you get sued, then you have at least said, well, actually, I did think about it. I knew about this. I'd learnt about at least part of the problem with it. And you are likely to be able to defend on the proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. It's when you actually know, because you've read a study or you've run a study, that actually associates X names, Muslims, with this, or women in this way. That's when you start finding yourself in real difficulties. And in practice, you're only going to know when someone complains and you have to go off and look about it, which is why I do very strongly recommend a bit of a sniff test. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't.
Technology intent nation. It also seems to be a process of homogenizing, simplifying, and creating some sort of perfect version of a fact. Isn't there a danger then, Kenneth? You're going to lose that.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think one thing to say here is that we don't really understand the epistemological status of what comes out of language models. So when people talk, when I make a claim, like, we take me to be asserting that claim, and we take there to be some sort of standard by which it would be appropriate to assert it. So you might think it's appropriate for someone to assert something only if they know that it's true, or only if they reasonably believe that it's true, or even if they're absolutely certain it's true, right? There's some kind of standard on me asserting something. Language models aren't like people. They just sort of output sentences which they take to be most likely to follow from the sentence you input into them. So it's not obvious that they're really asserting anything. They're just kind of putting together words based on statistical patterns that they've discovered in their training data. I think over time we're going to get a clearer picture of how to understand the factuality of these models and how they relate to actual human knowledge, because they are an important reservoir of knowledge. There's a lot of true claims that can be extracted from language models, but there's also a lot of utter nonsense. right? And making them say true claims is a very difficult technical problem, which we're still really getting to grips with. There are certain kind of hacks that you can do. So, for instance, Google's Lambda model has a sort of on top of the model is built a way for it to access Google search. So it can kind of do a search to back up its claims and give you a reference. That's one thing we can do to ensure the factuality of what's said. But ultimately, like at least for the time being, we shouldn't understand these models as sources of truth. They're really just knitting together, plausible sounding sentences.
About that, which is where you have things that aren't true, how do you deal with the impact of that, both legally and just, I guess, kind of morally or ethically? So I was thinking about an example if there's a company that's getting lots of support requests for a product that doesn't exist, but ChatGPT is saying it exists. So people are registering to say, could you give us this thing, and saying it doesn't work. How do you deal with something like that?
Do you want to about the legal side?
And legally, then it's a question of the company has problems in respect of reputation more than it has problems in respect of customers saying this doesn't work, this doesn't do this. They haven't got any contractual commitment. The company wouldn't have any duty of care. It's going to be quite hard for those customers or potential customers to take any action against the company at all. So where the problem comes is in reputation management. And then you get to, well, is the company actually going to take on the internet? Probably not. Is it going to engage search engine optimization or similar techniques to clear it off the internet? If it's a person, you use the right to be forgotten. So there are various bits and pieces that organizations can do. I will say, back to the person who helped me with my defamation point, his very strong view is you almost never do anything at all because it's almost never worth it. You never start something you're not going to finish. And whilst there is a whole pile of rubbish on the internet, the best place to think about it is to do it tomorrow, because if you wait till tomorrow, you probably won't do it at all. So he's actually a very strong advocate for bad reputational damage. You just let it wash over you rather than actually take action, because usually if you take action, it makes things worse rather than better. There are a few exceptions he will have to that rule, but certainly anything that we already deal with that's reputational damage, we usually do start with think about it tomorrow, because if you think about it tomorrow and it's not as bad, it will probably go away. And taking legal action, it's expensive. It can just make things an awful lot worse. It's the practical side that makes more sense. And I think that's the point where I'm going to go over to you.
Cool. Thank you. It's a really interesting question, and I think all of the companies engaged in developing language models are still trying to come to terms with how we think about factuality and how we ensure that models reliably produce, accurate information. Right now they have a tendency to just make things up. That's because they don't actually know anything. They're just stitching together what sound like coherent sentences. But with some of the techniques I mentioned, like the fine tuning and the reinforcement learning with human feedback, we're rapidly getting to a point where we can get models reliably to sort of say, I don't know, or to detect when they're making stuff up. But there's still a lot of work to go. So I think, it's still early days, but we need to see okay, once the models are integrated into product and those products have kind of big infrastructure around the models to make sure the models don't output things which are false or made up or suspect, I think then we'll be in a better position to sort of answer your question properly.
Another concern, this is for Geoff, it's another concern looking at deciding on who's making decisions as to what's appropriate and what's inappropriate for senior. Who's making this decision? Because you can have a certain section of the population which are deciding upon these facts, then creating and developing an AI system which is very, very narrow and maybe putting aside minority groups' views and so on. So how's that being controlled?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. So typically the way it's done is that they get individuals through like Amazon Mechanical Turk to just basically like rank order responses. As I understand it, you can do some sorts of diversity filtering, so you can ensure that you have a representative set of raters. But you might think that it's not even really the raters that matters. It's more like the guidelines that they're being told to rate in accordance with. And is there like appropriately inclusive input into those rating guidelines? Because really they're just kind of following instructions. I think there's a lot of work to do on properly outsourcing that and working out how do you have productive discussions with stakeholders about these kinds of questions. What kind of norms would be appropriate to govern these processes? How transparent do they need to be? Does it need to be one company or a partnership of companies, or even bringing regulators in to inform that effort? These are still super, super early days, and we're not sure, but we're trying.
Yes, in the back.
Okay, that's my work. It's not from the internet, whatever it is. It's a distance learning, so I don't get to see my tutors at all. But it just makes me wonder with ChatGPT, and I've really played it a little, so I don't really know a lot about it, whether it's like a very unique creation that it makes at a single time, even though the users say, oh, that's the same thing. But how is that gonna, do you think, be policed in the future if somebody is going to use ChatGPT to create the essays, parts of essays, what sort of policing, will there be for tutors or teachers? I'm a young mother, and my children are very small, but what I don't want my children to do in 5, 7, 8 years time, pretend to do their homework, be on the TikTok, I don't know even what's going on at the moment out there, that. And get the ChatGPT or likes of it, write the essays for them. How teachers, get the idea of, it's in your voice. Because at the moment, obviously, with anything that's anybody written, it's fairly easy to extract the text, put it on the internet, and it will come out if it exists.
One thing I can say that's already happening is that lots of private schools, not quite yet in the state system, are requiring people to do their homework in exam conditions with no internet connected, or handwrite it, which might make the younger generation realise they have got to write legible handwriting. I was talking about that to Brad when we were talking at the beginning. So that is already happening. That I think there will therefore be places where, if you're typing things in an exam type condition, the internet will be blocked and will be turned off. How that works for distance learning, that's going to be more of a struggle. But it is already the case that some of the education system, after ChatGPT and related tools started hitting the news big time, that actually homework became not quite a thing of the past in some of the schools, and that actually what people were then being asked to do at home was reading. So they changed some of how things work, or delivering content in what you might think of as a traditional lesson that was being done at home, and people were doing the writing in school with no internet, pen and paper, that type of thing. How much that's going to change, I don't know, but we are already hearing that those are effects that are happening. I will say, particularly in private schools where people are willing to put time and money into making sure their children get the best results.
Do you want to add anything, Geoff? No?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I think it's what we're going to see is a transition in human culture, probably of the order of the printing press. I think we should expect rapid change in the way in which people do their work. Right. I mean, people keep making the comparison with calculators. The sort of skill of arithmetic was in some way displaced by the invention of the calculator, and maybe it matters less now that we can do arithmetic. I think it's much bigger than that. Like the whole way in which people produce content across several different modalities, whether that's images, video, text, like we're just going to be able to produce this kind of content cheaper than we can find it. And it's like, we need to imagine what a world would look like in the good case, and then kind of go towards that, right? I think it's almost the wrong question to sort of suppose that in a few years' time our kids will still do homework in the same way. I think like the entire landscape is going to change.
Yes.
Well, I was wondering if you can see any kind of ethical issues that are going to come up from big AI or commercial contracts in the future, or the ones that you've already seen now.
I don't know.
And I don't do much in respect of commercial contracts. We also use bits and pieces of AI for all sorts of different things along those lines. Are there ethical issues with using it? Yes, if it's not properly regulated, because when you use whichever platforms you use and generate whatever content you use, and for example, I don't largely do it myself, but I quite often supervise very large data subject access requests, disclosure exercises, things along those lines. If the data that comes over that's then manipulated by AI, which it is because there's too much for a human being to do it in a sensible amount of time and therefore for a sensible amount of cost, what then happens with that data? Where's it then used? There are clearly ethical issues in respect of that obviously people expect that it's held securely, it's dealt with fairly, and yet increasingly, I don't know about yourself, but as I said when I was speaking, there are parts of this stuff I don't understand how some parts of it actually genuinely work. I know how to use it, I know what tools to use, I know what terms to do, I know how to tag all sorts of bits and pieces, I know all sorts of things like that. Do I know what happens underneath it? No, I'm not a data scientist, and I'm therefore vulnerable ethically, and more generally I have, as you have, ethical responsibilities. I'm vulnerable because I don't understand what is helping me if that is not handled ethically. So we had the question before, well, if you're big enough, if you're Cambridge Analytica, if you're someone along those lines and you just outspend, who cares about regulation? I can do that, this, that and the other. We're all going to have to grapple with those issues and the law won't catch up.
Just a little point of clarification. Does Cambridge Analytica still exist? I thought it was, its reputation became so toxic that actually it died.
No,
it got
the answer.
No, well, yes, I mean, but I thought that, I mean, there was one point was that how much did it have to pay? Another point was how much negative press did it get? And the answer was so much negative press, it's actually dead. That was my impression.
But it was more by ATP. There's a huge lawsuit between Packard and Analytica, which is still out.
Okay, so should we move to the panel session now?
Yeah, I think, if you could sort of sum up the 2 or 3 key takeaways. And then if you could hang around, people have questions.
Absolutely. So I think we're at a really, really interesting time where the rate of technological development is going at such a pace that the law is really struggling to keep up. And that puts us in a really strange grey area. On the one hand, we have pre-existing legislation that does have things to say about what's going on, and which technology companies and companies using the technology developed by those companies will need to come to terms with quite rapidly. On the other hand, there's also an awful lot of unregulated space, a lot of opportunity to drastically mess things up or to do things in the right way. And we need to be ethically innovative in terms of thinking about how we shape our technologies so that the benefits of those technologies are distributed equitably in a way that's appropriately inclusive. So I don't know. I think the big takeaway from today is that there are tremendous ethical and legal opportunities, but there are also tremendous risks. And what we need to do is make precise exactly where those risks are, whether it's norms on attribution, data privacy, bias, make precise those issues and develop coherent responses to them fairly rapidly and in a broad and inclusive way that brings in all the people who are going to be affected, which is pretty much everyone. So a representative group of people.
And I think from my side, I'm very much try to understand a little bit more about how the technology works. Because if you don't understand how it works, even if you're not, and I keep saying, I'm not a data scientist, I don't know this, I don't know that. But even if you're not going to know that, to know that there are various issues, to know kind of using English language rather than computer code, other language, what you're using, why you're using it, what it's for, and do the sniff test. If it doesn't quite feel right or you don't understand, ask more questions, because that's, at the moment at least, something that we as humans are able to do, not just because we've been told that if you ask what is the capital of France, the language will tell you it's Paris. It's, well, I'm not sure about this because, and I've always tried, whenever I give out practical advice, I usually say why. You have to be able to understand the why. And when you no longer have a why question to ask, then you're in a better position to know what you're doing. So not just assume it's all unremittingly positive, or it's just a fun tool that will help you write the sonnet by Shakespeare or finish your essay or whatever else it may be. At the moment, there is still an element of rubbish in, rubbish out. Is that going to remain or not? It's going to learn. But I'm optimistic and skeptical. And it's very much at that point where if you use any of these tools, and we all do, I mean, the woman from Shoesmith's like, well, I use AI to write contracts. I use AI. But I've asked enough questions to at least understand it. Do I know where it's vulnerable? Not entirely. But I don't assume it's not in any way, shape or form. And that's probably my one takeaway. If you're going to use it, don't assume it's all good or it's all bad. But at least think about what you're using it for and why. And keep asking why.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have and learned as much as I have. So thank you.